Back with you tonight here on In Focus. Thanks for staying on. World leaders will descend on New York this week to address the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Hot items on the agenda include the Russia-Ukraine conflict, mounting economic hardship, as well as environmental crises. Attached to this will be the ripple effect of rising food prices around the world, concerns over climate disruptions such as fires in Europe and devastating floods in Pakistan. Joining us now to discuss the mood and expectations is Voice of America's United Nations correspondent, Margaret Besheer. Margaret, good to have you with us tonight. Those talks expected to begin this hour. We're watching that feed closely. Nothing so far, but of course, what will be discussed there, quite key, is the challenge of disarmament, likely going to dominate, the challenge of climate change, the war in Ukraine. Can this body do anything about those things, and can it come up with any solutions to address those challenges?
Well, thanks for having me on, Tavo. We're just about to get underway with the afternoon session today in New York. I believe the president of Honduras is the next speaker who's coming on right now. Well, there is no shortage of crises, as Secretary General Antonio Guterres pointed out this morning. He gave a bit of a state of the world address to kick off the annual meeting. It was pretty grim. As you mentioned, climate, the food crisis, the economic crisis, conflicts, these are all top of the agenda. And he said that leaders really need to unite to address all these challenges, that we're getting nowhere as we are. So there's really little chance of progress unless there's political will. I think that's the bottom line.
Are world leaders willing to admit that our challenges are interlocked, are interconnected, and therefore we need a joint transformative solution to address them?
Yes, absolutely. I think that there is a lot of talk about that. Everything is really interlinked, interconnected in this world today. You know, certainly we've seen that with the war, with Russia's war in Ukraine, right? Because this invasion has not just affected Ukraine, and it's really having global ramifications, again, with the food, because Ukraine is a big grain producer, with energy, because energy costs are going up due to the war. So everything is interconnected, and we're seeing it in every corner of the world.
Does it matter who is attending? I mean, we know that President Biden will be making an address tomorrow. We know that the leader of Honduras, is, as you mentioned, was there. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, Turkish President. Our president, unfortunately, couldn't go because he had to come back and deal with an energy crisis here in the country. I believe the Russian president is also not there. Does it matter who is there?
So interesting you mentioned the Russian president isn't here. Neither is the Ukrainian president, because he can't really leave right now with the war at a critical point. But their situation is really stealing the spotlight, and yet they're not even here. But you're right. It is important that leaders come here, because anytime they're together in a room or in a corridor or at a lunch, there's an opportunity for dialogue, there's an opportunity for diplomacy, and there's an opportunity for breakthroughs. And I think that's why leaders feel that this week is so important. You know, there's a lot of talk, a lot of speeches. You know, maybe that doesn't add up to much, but it's the private sessions, I think, that are really very useful here. Otherwise, I don't think leaders would come. And this year is the first year since before the COVID-19 pandemic that leaders are here fully in person. In 2020, the Leaders Week went online completely. Everyone sent in video messages because the world was in lockdown in September of 2020. And last year it was a bit of a hybrid situation. Some people came, but many sent video messages. They were trying to keep the numbers down here in New York because we were still going through the COVID pandemic. So this year is the first time everyone's really back. And I think people are very excited to be back, too.
So, I mean, as you mentioned, none of these resolutions are binding, right? So, in other words, there is really no legal power that they must be carried out. All it really does indicate is the will of the various nations to say, yes, we do agree to this kind of move. So, what has really come out of those resolutions in the 77 times that this body has set?
Okay, so there's no resolutions being adopted this week. This week is what they call the annual debate. So this is just where everyone comes and presents the situation in their home country and things they're worried about, like climate change and that sort of thing. The General Assembly throughout the year meets, and those are opportunities to adopt resolutions. For instance, on March 2nd, 141 countries adopted a resolution in the General Assembly condemning Russia's war, its invasion of Ukraine, and that has a moral authority, a certain moral authority. It's not a legally binding resolution like what we see in the Security Council, but it has the moral authority. When you have 193 countries in the General Assembly, everyone's vote is equal, and they put their voices together to say they're for something, against something, demand something. It has an impact. And I think particularly in the case of the Ukraine and Russia war, there's a lot of talk about Russia being a bit isolated among other countries. You know, nobody wants to be a pariah state. So it can really have an impact.
Now, you've already mentioned that there will be, of course, key meetings that will happen on the sidelines, and that's more than anything else what is really important here. Is there expectations of maybe unexpected alliances, maybe even some diplomatic progress that might emerge out of this, seeing that it's not happening virtual, but is actually happening in person?
Well, I think there are a few things that are important I'd like to highlight for your viewers. Right now, as we're chatting, there's a food summit going on. Macky Sall, the president of the African Union, is one of the co-hosts of that. And Secretary Blinken from the United States is another. The European Union is also co-hosting. And they're trying to really address the food security crisis. And as well, tomorrow, President Biden will be hosting a session that's intending to raise around $20 billion to replenish a fund that helps assist with tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV/AIDS programs around the world. So when things like that happen, it really has an impact. The Secretary General of the United Nations often says discreet diplomacy is the best. So a lot of what we're seeing in front on the screen right now at the podium, that's just public talking. But really, the behind-the-scenes things that we don't see is probably where most of the work gets done. But it's always good to hear what other leaders are thinking in those public speeches and what their plans are, So it's always good to have this sort of a dialogue in the public eye for the world to see.
Yeah. The General Assembly also planning to have a summit next year where they will adopt the final draft of the pact for the future. Do we pick up from any of these speeches? What is the addresses that are going to happen? What possibly will be included in that final draft?
It's a bit early. That meeting isn't until late next year, I believe. So it's a bit early for that. I think right now, this week, honestly, the most pressing issues are the food and fuel and fertilizer crises we're seeing around the world, particularly fertilizer. A lot of leaders are talking about it. The price of fertilizer is 3 times what it was in 2021. And fertilizer needs to get to farmers right away because it's the planting season in many parts of the world. And if there is not a good yield, a good harvest in the next season, we're going to see more food shortages. We'll see food shortages. Right now, it's more of a price issue, but next year it could be a supply issue. So they really want to see that averted, and everyone acknowledges that's one of the issues that really needs immediate attention. And part of that, again, goes back to Russia. They need to release some of their fertilizer to world markets. The Spanish Prime Minister was just speaking at the Food Summit, and he said that Putin is trying to blackmail the international community with a large part of the world's food needs. And he's talking in particular there about the fertilizer. Russia has been saying that Western sanctions are prohibiting the sale of its fertilizer. Western leaders are saying, no, our sanctions have nothing to do with food or fertilizer coming out of Russia. But the problem is some private sector businesses, shipping companies, insurers, they're not confident in doing business with Russia now. Some, for public relations reasons, they don't want to be linked with Russia, and others because they're just afraid to run afoul of potential sanctions. They're complicated sanctions. So even if it's not a sanction, they're afraid to run afoul in some way of some layer of it. So, but everyone agrees, from the Secretary General to most of the world leaders we're hearing today, this needs to be addressed, and quickly. Literally weeks.
Speaking of Russia, the fertilizer and so on, and the war and so on, there is a sense also that there is some paralysis at the UN Security Council, particularly when it comes to that veto. Do you think that is also going to form part of what will be deliberated here, at least some kind of reform of the Security Council?
Absolutely. Security Council reform is always on the minds of countries that are beyond the permanent 5 members. Everybody outside of, China, France, Britain, the United States, and Russia would like to see Security Council reform. And Macky Sall said today that, he was speaking actually about the G20. He was saying he would like to see Africa have a seat at the G20. But, for years we've heard Africa say they should have a seat on the Security Council, particularly since about 80% of the Council's business has to do with Africa. Recently, we had a vote in the UN General Assembly where they overwhelmingly decided that any time from now on that the veto is used in the Security Council, the country that cast that veto should come and explain to the membership of the General Assembly, to the international community, why that veto was used. So this is sort of really a big change, and Russia has had to come already before the General Assembly to explain its use of the veto since this resolution was adopted a few months ago. So they're looking for accountability.
Margaret, appreciate your time, and thank you very much for highlighting those important issues for us tonight. Voice of America, United Nations correspondent, Margaret Besheer there. The leader of the United States, President Joe Biden, expected to make his address tomorrow there at the UN General Council. Of course, the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, had to send the Minister of Durban to be the representative there, as he had to rush back to deal with the energy crisis. And tomorrow we know he is going to be chairing that cabinet meeting, which will be largely dealing with the situation of Eskom.